thank you for coming, to Cindy coming back to campus, and to Yvonne for coming for the first time, and hopefully not the last, to talk about the crisis of trafficking of girls from Nigeria. And with that, I turn it over to your conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having us, and thanks all of you to being here. Yvonne and I know that you guys have finals next week, and so we are so grateful to you for taking a study break and coming out to visit with us. Okay, the La Pietra campus looks exactly like the college I wish I had attended. That's what I want to say. Texas A&M did not look like this. Just want to put that out there. So we are so excited to be here today. Vital Voices, for those of you who do not know us, we are an NGO. We were founded by a woman you may have heard of named Hillary Clinton to advance women's leadership around the world. And I'm so excited to be here today. I run the human rights programs at Vital Voices, and Yvonne is one of the amazing women leaders that Vital Voices has the privilege of working with. And I'm so excited to get to introduce her to you, and I know that you will be as impressed with her as I am. I first met Yvonne when she participated in one of the programs that Vital Voices offers. It's called the Global Freedom Exchange, and it convenes 25 women every year from all over the world, including the United States, who are working to end trafficking with a specialization in ending sex trafficking. Evon established an amazing NGO in Nigeria called PathFinders. And what I think is so unique about Yvonne is that she is from Nigeria, and that's what Vital Voices believes strongly in. We work with local women leaders who know better than anybody what will work in their communities. Yvonne grew up in Edo State in Nigeria. She, not surprisingly, got herself a scholarship and came to the United States. She is an attorney licensed in the UK and in New York, one of the hardest bar exams out there. And she had a very lucrative career in the law in New York. But in 2014, she decided to go back to her home state in Edo State and address the terrible problem of human trafficking. And so she created her initiative in 2014, and I'm going to have her talk with us a little bit about how did you get big enough ovaries? It takes some big ovaries to leave a lucrative law career and go back to Edo State. And so tell us, what is it that made you decide to make what must have been a courageous move?
First of all, well, thank you all so much for being here and for being a part of this discussion. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Cindy, as well. I'm honored to be here. But you know, in 2013, I was working at my law firm in New York as a partner, and I got to a place that I refer to it as having the gift of discomfort. So I hated what I was doing. I was making good money. I had the corner office. I wish I was looking at a view like this, but I wasn't. I was looking at another cement wall, for those of you who've been to New York. And I started getting this sense of urgency about leaving. And it was the sort of thing where every day I was, having to talk myself into going to work and, representing other lawyers, as a matter of fact. And I finally just got to a place where one weekend I was reading a book called Let Your Life Speak. And it's by an author named Parker Palmer. And I add this part to the story because there's so many of you young students here who are possibly trying to figure out exactly what you've been called to do, what your mission is here on this earth. And there was a line in a poem in that book that said, "Ask me whether what I've done is my life." And at that point, I was, over 10 years in my practice, and that whole weekend, it was a Friday, and that weekend, that line just kept resonating in my spirit. Ask me whether what I've done is my life. And I just kept saying, no, this is not my life. I don't want to be remembered as a lawyer's lawyer. And that was on a Friday, and on Monday, I just decided, you know, this is it. I walked into my senior partner's office, I handed him my resignation letter, and I said, I'm gonna go do what my life has been calling me to do. I'm heading back to Nigeria. And he thought I was having a nervous breakdown because he said, you know, it just doesn't happen, you know, like a black woman, you are the definition of success in America. And I said, but for me, success is not what I'm currently doing. I had to make a choice between significance and success. And for me, success is when you are doing what you've been called to do. And so I made that decision, and I had to give them 3 months notice because I was a partner. But in December of 2014, December 2013, the 31st was my last day. And so as I drove out of my law firm, I just remember looking up and saying, oh my God, what did I just do? How am I going to live? Like, how do people on the other side survive, you know, on $10,000 a year, whatever activists are making? But I had this sense of peace and a sense that this was the right time for me to do what I was called to do. So I suppose at the end of the day, the bottom line is that I believe that I'm doing what my life has been speaking to me to do. It's my life's work, it's like my life's mission. And I like to say that I believe in stretching tight shoes. A lot of people always ask me, what does that mean, you believe in stretching tight shoes? And I say that because when I was a young child growing up in Nigeria, my mom, you know, would come to the US or to England, and she would, you know, she would draw our feet on pieces of paper, and then she would take them to the store and say, you know, this is, you know, I want to buy shoes for my daughter, for my sons, and then she'd bring them back. And we would squeeze our feet into them. It didn't matter what size they were, but because who doesn't want shoes like, you know, from England and from the US. But I realized that became a consistent theme in my life was, you know, stretching shoes for, particularly for my younger sisters. I would wear their shoes to stretch them out for a day or two. But as I grew older, I realized, wow, this is what I'm called to do, is to create more space for people, particularly marginalized women and children, at the tables of their lives.
I think that's such a great analogy. I love that analogy, and I heard you say that when we were in DC, and I'm so glad that you reminded me of my new favorite saying, which I'm going to steal now. I wanted to talk to us a little bit about the trafficking problem in Edo State, because it has a place of some significance. So can you share with us a little bit about the trafficking problem in Edo State and what it has to do with here in Italy?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that everybody, you know, pretty much knows now that Nigeria is a big hub for sex trafficking, but more specifically, my home state of Edo State. I'm actually from Benin City, which is the primary hub in all of Nigeria. And so, you know, we know that the trafficking from Africa to Europe is a $150 million industry, right? And that almost every woman who is working in prostitution is generating almost $100,000 a year for each trafficker. But as far as the face of trafficking in Edo State, it actually looks quite different, I think, from the way that it appears in many other places, particularly in the US. But in Nigeria specifically, in Edo State, 1 out of every 3 women has generally been recruited into trafficking. And when I'm talking about the women and the girls, I'm talking about generally women between the ages of 15 and 25. Right, so a third of our women in Edo State have been recruited. There is some statistics that indicate that 80% of the homes in Edo State have some level of involvement with trafficking. So either as a survivor, or as a recruiter, or as a victim, or someone who's a madame. But 80% of the homes, and so, you know, it's part of our functioning economy. And you know, what generally happens is that the girls are recruited by, you know, usually somebody in their family. Mothers primarily are the negotiators of contracts with the traffickers, and then there's a process of them being transported, and then the exploitation that usually happens over in Europe, with Italy being the #1 destination country.
Now, what's interesting to me is that Edo State is not the poorest state in Nigeria. It is not the state where Boko Haram is rampant. It is not the state that is home to the least educational opportunities. So it doesn't seem like it would be the prime target. What is it about Edo State that has kind of made it such a place of vulnerability?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Edo State is also not one of the largest states in Nigeria. Nigeria has a population of about 180 million people. Edo State only has about 3.5 to 4 million, right? But 95% of the women who are trafficked from Nigeria come from Edo State, right? So on a macro level, Nigeria has issues primarily with security. Cindy, you mentioned Boko Haram, the terrorist group that's wreaking havoc in the northeast. We also have a big issue with youth and unemployment. So almost half of the 67 million youth that we have in Nigeria are unemployed. And we know that there's also, obviously, a lot of corruption. If anybody knows anything about Nigeria, that's a big, big issue that we're facing. But on a more micro level, I think Edo State historically has been one of the places in Nigeria that has had the most exposure to the West, right? So starting in the 16th century, the Benin Kingdom was one that was establishing a lot of trade, international trade with Portugal and then with England. And so a lot of our, you'll see a lot of our bronzes in historical museums. And there was, a trade being established. And so the Edo people began to have a lot more interaction and exposure in a way that the rest of Nigeria was not necessarily having. And so in the 1980s, a lot of our women, because Italy was actually allowing for what we refer to as circular migration, where you can actually come here and work and then return back, a lot of our women were coming from Edo State to Italy and working in agriculture, helping to harvest tomatoes and things like that. And then they were taking that money that they were earning and going back to Nigeria. And it became this way of really being able to lift your family out of abject poverty for people who were in that economic bracket. And so that business then became more illicit as the years went by. And so in the 1990s, women realized that they could actually make more money working in prostitution here in Italy because the demand was so high for Black African bodies. And so the business then transformed from something that was illegal to something that is not necessarily illegal, but not criminalized, at least here in Italy. But at that point, it was almost too late. So Edo women started to view prostitution as an alternative to poverty. Italy became synonymous, right, for people who were in that economic bracket with being able to lift your family out of poverty. And so that's why you see such a large percentage, coming from Edo State as opposed to other parts of the country.
You mentioned that it's often a family member, and specifically a mother, that might be facilitating this. And I think that, and especially because it's become so well known, and I think that sometimes the fact that a mother is facilitating it, or maybe even that a young woman might know, she might have some idea about what's going on out there, she might know, but that becomes synonymous with, well, then it wasn't trafficking.
Right.
And yet, I think you described to me that, first of all, if they're under the age of 18, they can't consent to any sort of sex act, period.
Right.
But even over the age of 18, I think that when you've talked to the women, even what they thought they were signing up for, is that in fact what they got when they got here?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that all of it is driven by economics, right? So a lot of the women who are in this age demographic between 15 and 25 are the ones who are living on $1 a day, which is the reality for 1/3 of the people in Edo State. So because of the corruption that is literally killing Nigerians, you find that a lot of women are more susceptible, more vulnerable to being trafficked. And so I think what the reality is that you have poverty working in combination with pressure from parents, with lack of economic opportunities, and with a lack of education. So what we found is that it's this toxic combination that then renders women and young girls vulnerable to being trafficked. So back in the 90s, there was a lot of deception where women were actually not told that they were going to be forced into prostitution in Europe. Europe, what they were told was that they were coming over to Europe to work as a nanny, to work in sales, as a clerk at a store. But then as the business has sort of become a lot more lucrative, women are now aware, they're told by the traffickers that you are going to be working in prostitution when you get over to Italy. But the reality is that a lot of them don't actually know what that looks like in actuality, right? So they don't
I think
know.
it's Pretty Woman.
Yeah, well, yeah, you guys, Pretty Woman, yeah.
Yeah.
The movie. So I think nobody tells them, that you're going to be earning, 5 euros per transaction, 10 euros per transaction. What they're told is that it will take you 6 months, to pay off this debt of, which could be anywhere from 30 to 60,000 euros, right? And they don't realize that at that rate of earning 5 to 10 euros, they're going to be having sex with anywhere between 10, 15 men every single day. Most of the survivors that we've worked with have had their bodies abused by anywhere between 4,000 to 5,000 men over a three-year period of time. So that's where the level of deception actually comes in.
You shared with me earlier that the traffickers know that once a woman arrives here, she's not going to want to stay. And that you described some of the really unusual things that they are doing to make sure that they feel trapped and that they feel like they cannot return home. And I'm wondering if you could share with us, because I think it's helpful for us to understand how difficult it is for a woman to simply walk away once she realizes, oh my gosh, this is not what I thought I was signing up for.
Right. Part of the reality is that once they arrive in Europe, their passports are taken away. They don't understand, obviously, the context. They don't understand the language. They can't, fend for themselves in that way. But even prior to them leaving Nigeria, what has been happening, particularly in Edo State, is that they're taken by the trafficker or by the recruiter, accompanied by their mothers a lot of times, to what we refer to as juju priests or voodoo priests. These are local native doctors who make the women, cut portions of their pubic hair, mix it with blood, and have all sorts of kind of crazy rituals for women who actually believe in the power of these sorts of things. And then they make them swear, take an oath that they will repay their madams, who generally are former trafficking victims themselves, who have now become traffickers, that they will repay the entire debt to the madame, and that if they fail to do so, something horrible will happen to them. They'll be killed. Their family members will be threatened and things like that. And so psychologically, that creates a way of, essentially ensuring your return on investment, right? Because it costs the trafficker about $5,000 to bring the woman over to Europe, but then they charge the woman at, $50,000, $60,000 to repay back.
And you brought that scenario up in the context of, and I so appreciate this is a problem that is, in some ways, it's something that you have to be an expert in the local language and the local culture and the local context in order to really fix. And I know that you've described some of the things that you and PathFinders have been able to do to make it easier for victims to escape this or to not even, be trafficked in the first place. And I'm wondering if you could describe what's been done with the Oba of Benin to kind of remedy this terrible restraint that some of the victims have felt.
Okay, so the Oba of Benin is our king, our local sort of king, and he supposedly, for those people who believe in the indigenous sort of local gods that are worshipped in different parts of Africa, is the supreme spiritual being that controls that world. And so he, on March 9th of 2018, just this year, he renounced all the curses that had been placed on traffickers. I'm sorry, not on traffickers, but on victims of trafficking, right? So all the swearing that they did, you know, at the juju priests, the voodoo priests, have now all been renounced, right? And so the victims no longer have to repay the traffickers. So many of them who are now in Europe are being able to actually walk away from their madams, because psychologically there was that fear that if they left, something would happen to them. And so I was mentioning to you that for me is why we need African solutions to African problems, right? So it's fair and good that Europe is primarily invested in this issue because it's become a crisis on the migrant end of things, right? But the most effective way of addressing sex trafficking is by going to the local context. And so in addition to the things that, you know, the Oba's pronouncement, we're also focused on trying to do a lot of prevention efforts, because our goal in Nigeria is structural transformation. We actually want our women to stay because we believe that they're economic assets, and that every single one that takes that trip through Libya or flies over here on a legal visa, whatever it is essentially brain drain, right? That is an economic asset that could be contributing to our local context, but instead is working in prostitution and not necessarily doing anything that's helping either Nigeria or her family.
And can you talk some more about your organization, PathFinders, what you do and what your target population is? What are the services that you're providing?
Okay, so we're both rehabilitation and prevention focused. Right, so on the rehabilitation end of it, we are providing what we refer to as our PATH plans, personalized action to healing plans, because we believe that every woman is an individual, and so each rehabilitation plan is customized specifically to that woman. And so some of the things we offer are legal services, because many of the women have had their passports taken away, they don't have any legal identity whatsoever. We also offer medical services, because women are, been infected with HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases. Many of them were beaten up by the purchasers. We have some girls who were actually thrown off of, third, fourth story buildings. Many of them were gang raped and are dealing with the implications of that, unwanted pregnancy and things like that. We also offer counseling services as well, vocational skills training, education scholarships for girls that want to go back to school. We're providing capital for them to start up businesses. We're finding them jobs. And so essentially what we say to the survivor is, what does rehabilitation look like for you? And we allow them to choose from any of those things what they'd like to do to see their lives on the path to recovery and healing. We're also focused on prevention, right, which is my primary focus as an individual in the organization, because I believe that every single woman should live a life that is dignified. I believe that no one should be robbed of their agency or self-determination. And so what we're trying to do is give women an alternative to poverty by providing skills training and helping them, view themselves as part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem in Nigeria.
Yeah, I know that you have a really innovative program where you are utilizing your survivor advocates. I mean, now some survivors want to just be done with it and I never want to talk about it again. But some survivors really want to use their experience to help others. And I was wondering if you would describe how you kind of use your survivor advocates as a way to help prevent some of the future trafficking.
Right, so when we conduct outreaches, so we go out to the marketplaces, we go to churches, to mosques, to anybody who will listen, really, to schools. We're on television, we're on radio, we reach over 1 million people every single day through our radio programs. But it's not just important for someone like me who has a lot of privilege, who grew up with a family who had the finances to send me over to England to study or whatever it is, because a lot of the girls sort of look at me as completely disconnected from their day-to-day reality. And so what we found is that because our survivors have the lived experience, because our survivors are the most credible messengers, the ones who are ready and prepared are actually part of our program. They've moved from victim to survivor to advocate for us, right? And so they're the ones who are coming with us to the marketplaces. They're the ones who are telling their stories. They're the ones who are engaging with the mothers to say, this is the reality of what your decision had on me. And they're so much more effective, God knows, than I could ever be.
You, going back a minute, you mentioned that this is something that is really prevalent here in Italy. What is it about Italy as opposed to, another European country? Why is it that there are so many Nigerian women here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first reason is what I mentioned earlier as far as, the women from Edo State in the 1980s. But the reality too is that unfortunately, it's just the proximity, right? So Italy is literally right there off the coast of Libya. But I think a third point is the fact that Italy is really, really lax on prosecution. You guys, we had 11,000 Nigerian women come over to Italy in 2016. And I think there were something like 72 prosecutions against traffickers, right? So people realize now, particularly from Nigeria, that, look, Italy's not going to do anything about this. You're not going to address the demand. You're not going to, arrest and prosecute traffickers. So it essentially is a no-risk or very low-risk business.
You mentioned another thing, that sometimes when European countries or Western countries try to do things like negotiating with Libya or something, there are some pretty significant, perhaps unintended consequences for victims. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about how those policies have these ripple effects.
Well, I think part of Europe's approach, right, was to, Italy specifically, because Italy was bearing the brunt of a lot of the migrants who were coming, not just from Syria, but also from Africa. 90% of the migrants were taking off from Libya and coming into Italy. I think it was 180,000 that were received by Italy in 2016. Last year, I think it was about 117,000. But Italy is, particularly on the heels of the economic crisis that was happening here, really unable to absorb the number of people. And there's also a growing anti-migrant sentiment as well. And so I think part of what happened, as I'm sure many of you know, was that in February of 2017, Italy approached the Libyan government, so the UN recognized the Libyan government and said, look, what can you do to help us address this problem? Italy paid the Libyan government $230 million to say, look, keep the migrants on your side. And that supposedly was through creating this Libyan Coast Guard that was supposed to patrol the waters in Libya to try to keep all the migrants on that side. But as a result of it, there was, I believe, a certain level of complicity, right? Because what the Libyan government then did was outsource this job to the militia, who know no other way than military efforts that have affected migrants in a way that is not only dehumanizing, but has really subjected them to torture and rape. And so to a certain extent, it's my belief that there is a certain level of not just complicity, but complacency on the part of the European government. Because the reality is that migrants are suffering in these detention camps that have been set up by the Libyan Coast Guard.
And of course, a lot of that suffering was pretty well documented by CNN and some of the other news outlets, which at least brought it to light.
Right.
Now, one thing that I have appreciated about all of our prior discussions, and also when you participated in the program, and I got to spend 2 weeks with her, and I know you're so jealous, but one of the things I appreciated is that you've made it clear that this is not somebody else's problem, or that, this is just the West's problem or European. You've been really clear that there is blame and there is work that can be done all around. And I was wondering if if from your position where you are now, what are some things that you would like to see changed, both in Edo State to make it to where young people are not trying to leave to go, but also from the West, from the US and Europe? What can we do to help the problem and not create these exacerbating situations for victims?
Well, I mean, I think primarily it's an African, more specifically a Nigerian and then Edo State problem. I think that Nigeria and Edo State should be leading in solutions, right? Because ultimately Nigeria is what has created the vulnerability for women to start to view prostitution as an alternative to poverty, right? So our corruption in our government is a big issue because you have people who believe that they are entitled to steal millions, hundreds of millions of dollars and couldn't care less about the consequences of it, right? And so part of my focus is on addressing policy and ensuring that the legislature, that our government, that our presidents are held accountable, right, for the implications of their decisions. And so we do a lot of training with government. I'm not afraid to call people out. I report anything that I hear that is being led by Nigeria. I have no problem with contacting the international community to say, look, this is something that's happening, you need to look into it. And I think that I've developed a reputation that has probably made my mother quite afraid at night to sleep because there are obviously consequences to standing up and against things like this. But as far as, locally in Edo State, we're trying to develop to craft the political will of our government. Because a lot of people say, oh, well, there's no political will. But we as the citizens have the power and the authority to determine what the political will be by saying to the government, this is what you need to be focusing on. And until you do it, we will shame you into doing it if you choose not to do it on your own. And so that's part of what my role and my job is. You need to be focused on creating jobs for our youth. Because if they don't have something to do and they're not in a position where they can support themselves economically and they're watching their children starve to death. I mean, I'm a mother, and I know that if my daughter, God forbid, was sick and I couldn't afford the malaria medicine to help get her better, I may make some decisions and choices that I would hope, Cindy, you would never find out about. But you're not going to put me in a position where I have to choose between my daughter's life and and whether or not I'm going to find a way to survive. I will choose my child any day, right? And I think most mothers, and you don't even have to be a mother to be able to understand what that means. So we're trying to get the government to be more active in creating jobs, to create the infrastructure that will make it inviting for companies, for the private sector to actually produce, to actually, plant their feet in Edo State and actually build businesses. But as far as the international community, I think one of the things, people ask me, like, what can Europe do? And I think the first thing I mentioned already is just addressing the demand, right? Because as somebody mentioned earlier, it's basic economics. If there's no demand, there won't be supply, right? You need to be prosecuting traffickers. You can't have 11,000 women brought over to Europe in 2016 and only have 72, not even necessarily prosecution, investigations, right? Because then people start to think, this is a way for me to, effectively commoditize human beings as a resource. I think that another thing is creating more legal pathways, right? So when you make it so difficult for the average person in Nigeria who wants to actually come over here or come over to Europe and study and come over and work, when you make it so hard to get a visa, I mean, it's almost impossible to get a visa. When you make it that difficult, you're not creating possibilities of pathways or bilateral agreements where people can study and go back home. The desperation of people is going to force them to make choices and decisions that ultimately will translate to what we now see as a migrant crisis. I think that one of the other things I usually recommend is really working with migrants, right? Humanizing them, right? Because as an African woman, as a Nigerian woman, trauma leaves a mark on me the same way it does on anybody else, right? I'm affected by the way that people view me, and there's sort of this, there is this growing anti-migrant sentiment because migrants are not humanized, right? And so that's why you see violence that's also being perpetrated against them because people are frustrated by the reality of what's actually happening. I don't think it's enough to throw money at the problem and consider it an economic development approach, because a lot of times what happens to this money is that it goes to the pockets of the government, and the people who actually need it for economic development are not actually receiving it.
I feel like you are such a good emissary and representative for Nigeria and Edo State, and I'm wondering how, I can see on the one hand that the Nigerian government would want to say, yes, she's one of ours, isn't she amazing and doing great work? But I could also see them saying, shh, that's, don't draw attention to this, don't highlight this problem. And I'm wondering, how have you been received? You were received very well in the U.S. and I'm sure here in Italy, but how are you received back home in Nigeria? Do they recognize what a gem, or do you make them a little nervous?
It all sort of depends on what the motivation is, right? So next year we have elections coming up in Nigeria. And
Are you running?
Yeah, no, I'm not running.
Oh.
I'm not running. But now it's like it's a topic of conversation, right? Because people want to be seen as actually addressing the issue. The European Union's also put a lot of pressure on Nigeria by trying to force them into readmission agreements, so forcing illegal people who are illegal in the countries here back to Nigeria, and so that has become a primary focus for a platform, I should say, that people are running on for elections. So when it serves their purpose, then they want to hug me and welcome me in. But on the other hand, a lot of people are very embarrassed by the shaming that I think is absolutely necessary. But you should not have to force a government to care, about its people. And so for me, that's, I don't mind being used as long as it accomplishes the purpose ultimately that we're trying to get to.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the questions, and I specifically want to make sure that those of you who are in the room, if you guys have questions for Yvonne or comments about some of her remarks, she has graciously said that she would be happy to visit with you and to answer questions if you have any.
I have a question. Yvonne, what do you know about the organization of the trafficking here? On the demand side, what is the kind of organizational structure that is bringing girls and women from Nigeria to Italy and putting them into service?
Yeah, there's certainly there's the Mafia that ultimately, the Italian Mafia that ultimately is involved to a certain extent. There's also the Nigerian Mafia that's very actively engaged, and so the women who are the madams are certainly on the lower parts of the hierarchy. But certainly, I know that when I was in Castel Volturno earlier this year, I came to visit, and I was walking on the streets because I wanted to actually see what the reality was for our girls. There were stretches of portions of streets where the madams were paying somebody in the Nigerian Mafia who was then paying somebody in the Italian Mafia for that stretch of land for their girls to be able to solicit. And so it's structured in that sense where people actually, where there's a hierarchy, right, of trafficking. Well, on the more local level in Nigeria, I mean, you have people who are recruiters on every level. We've had a case where one of our survivors brought a claim, prosecuted the claim against her pastor who recruited her into trafficking. We have mothers that are, like I mentioned earlier, that are also part of the ring. But as it sort of gets higher in the hierarchy, it's a lot more organized.
I was surprised when you mentioned that there was such a big talk for trafficking, because I've been here for almost a year and I have barely seen any African women.
Well, you're on the beautiful campus, so the chances are kind of low.
Yeah. I'm also Stanford Law,
okay.
and I've barely seen any. Do you think this lack of visibility is what's causing the government to be so apathetic and so inactive in some of the problems?
I don't know if it's visibility, because when I was in Rome, I certainly saw a lot, and I think as you go further down south, you'll see a lot more women. But I think it also has a lot to do with who the women are, right? So they're Black African women, and our bodies don't matter as much as if it were Italian women sort of walking on the streets who are, 13. I mean, if you have a 13 or 14-year-old on the street that is soliciting for prostitution, I can't imagine that if this was a white Italian girl, that the police would just be driving by and have absolutely no comment about it. The fact that that purchasers are not criminalized when they are purchasing from somebody who they know is a trafficking victim is problematic, right? So I don't think it's necessarily just the lack of visibility, but I think it's also who these women are.
There are places where it's very visible, driving down country roads where there's every, mile, there's a young girl on the side of the road, or in Rome, or in certain urban areas that, yeah, right. In the more kind of industrial or working areas, more than in the center of Florence, right?
One thing we noticed as part of the Global Freedom Exchange, we have now at Vital Voices worked with over 100 anti-trafficking experts like Yvonne, but also the Yvonne in India and the Yvonne in Russia and the Yvonne in Mexico. And one thing that has been really clear is that, especially in destination countries, which are frequently Western Europe, the United States, North America, it's not unique to Italy, the US too. We care a lot more about American citizens we shouldn't, but law enforcement, your local law enforcement, they're absolutely more aggressive, I think, and I was a former prosecutor, in going after citizens rather than people who, well, you should have been careful, that's why you shouldn't have come here, it's not right. But I just wanted to say it's not unique to Italy. I definitely see that in the United States. I see it with our advocates from Canada. I think that we do kind of prioritize our victims, with citizens and young people being far more sympathetic than someone who is from another country or someone who's a little bit older.
Yeah.
We definitely prioritize.
Yeah, and I mean, it happens in Nigeria too. Even on a local level, there's a lot of distinction between, depending on what tribe you're from, right? So people will not react. I'm an advocate for Bring Back Our Girls, which is, advocates for the return of the Chibok girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram in 2014. And, this was something that happened in the north of Nigeria. I'm from the south of Nigeria. And when we try to get people to come out to protest, they say, oh, it's a northern problem, let them deal with it, And so it's just a disparity of other, right? When you don't see somebody else because of your own limited experience, right? And the dehumanizing that we do, to one another in general.
Yes.
Yeah, a few questions. Do you know Isoke? Because she's a Nigerian woman who is working very well in Italy also for shelter or former victims of trafficking. What do you think about her job? And second, in Italy we know that the mama are women who are organizing trafficking in human beings. And do you work also with mama just to change mentality? And the third question is that I read a few weeks ago that His Majesty the Oba of Benin renounces curses on victims of human trafficking. What do you think about that? Okay, sorry, yeah. Okay, sorry, I didn't get, okay.
Right.
And no, it was about the mama. And Isoke, the work done by Isoke.
I've not met Isoke, but I've heard about her work. And there are four other organizations that we're working with here in Italy. I think it's important to have Nigerian women also addressing the issue on this side of it, because they tend to serve as cultural mediators, right? Which is something that I think sort of helps to bridge the gap between survivors of trafficking and the local government. And agencies that are working in that space. And so I'm sure I'll meet her at some point, but so far I haven't met her yet. On the issue of the madams, did you have a question about it?
Yeah, whether you are also trying to work with them in order that to change mentality, because they did a lot of kidnaps for women and so on. So is not only a matter to change the mentality of men, but also of Nigerian women who, so to say, supported also the trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, the reality, like I mentioned, is that 90% of the women who are actually the madams were former trafficking victims themselves, right? So to a certain extent, it's hard to believe that someone who's gone through the hell of what trafficking actually looked like and took and what trafficking actually robbed from them is able to do this to somebody else, right? So one of the things that we focus on, and whenever we have discussions or we're trying to come up with programming, is we look around to see who's missing at the table, right? So not only are survivors generally missing, even from a forum like this, but we also have started working with a lot of madams, former traffickers themselves, right? Because they're the ones who can actually tell us, what the gaps were and what rendered them vulnerable, right? Because to be able to commoditize a human being and look at them as a dollar figure, something has definitely gone wrong in your perspective. We know that poverty generally affects judgment and it affects IQ by up to 14 points from what I'm told, right? So when you're in a position where you've either had to deal with poverty or you've gone through that sort of abuse on your own body, the implications of that are what we generally see. And so I definitely think that it's an important aspect of the work that we do, is trying to work with madams and former traffickers as well. And then I think I mentioned about the Oba's pronouncement. I think it's a reflection of African solutions to African problems. It's certainly been a lot more effective. As a result of it, we've had a lot more survivors here in Italy and many other parts of Europe that have been contacting us to say, now I can walk away from my madame, but now I'm stuck, I'm here, I have no other alternative, and we don't want to force them back into prostitution, right? So what we're saying is, what I've been doing with a lot of the calls that we've been getting is trying to connect them with NGOs here in Italy that can help, with asylum applications, that can help with filing for subsidiary protection or humanitarian protection for them.
Yeah, in Italy we have also Article 18 about migration, where it said that women who want to go away for trafficking, they could have just not to denounce the pimps, but just to have the permit of residence if they try to go out of prostitution, trafficking. Do you encourage also women to use Article 18, which is by law in Italy?
Look, I sort of feel like, whatever is a possibility is something that should be considered, right? So a lot of these women don't necessarily want to come back to Nigeria because they know what the reality is. They know that our government is not necessarily going to engage in their livelihood. A lot of them are not aware of organizations like mine who are dedicated solely to helping women create a path for themselves. And so if there is a possibility to be able to stay here in Italy, then certainly I think that
it's very important to know that they can have the permit to stay. In Italy, also they have also to say, I don't say the names of people who traffic me, but they have then to make some processes just to go out, and then also there are places where they can get work or learn how to work. So it's very important also to know all these possibilities that the Italian law offers to this.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think that again, I think that that's part of having agency, right? Having self-determination is to be able to decide what is best, right, for you. Certainly I would like for our women to come back to Nigeria. I feel like, any woman who has endured 3 years of that sort of abuse and been able to come out of it still sane and still being able to rationalize is certainly who I want on my team. These are strong, powerful human beings. And so when they come back to Nigeria, they're able to be the kind of testimony of survival that many people are not able to endure.
So I was wondering, with regard to the rehabilitation effort here in Italy, the rehabilitation effort that you were mentioning earlier, how do you find the providers to offer the support and the services, and how is it possible to help? Because I'm a psychologist, I'm here, I speak English, I speak Italian. I would like to help, but I don't know how to do it.
Okay. Well, I think that part of, I know that many more Italian organizations have started using cultural mediators, right? And so, like I said, that's somebody who sort of is usually Nigerian, and that can help to explain what the survivors need and feel to the organization itself. So, you know, we partner with, I'll use On the Road, for example, which is an NGO, and they have cultural mediators who are able to, you know, sort of bridge that gap. And so the organization is able to better serve the survivors. But another thing I think is being in a position where you as a citizen, like I mentioned earlier about crafting the political will, right? Ensuring that survivors are seen as human, but also demanding from your government what you'd like to see happen for survivors, right? So people always ask me, you know, what can I do? And I always say, like, what would you do if it was you? Right? If it was your sister, if it was your daughter, right? And then all of a sudden there are ideas that sort of start, people start to come up with ideas, but I think it's essentially lobbying the government for me, right, to change some of the policies, right? So if you know, going after knowing purchasers, knowing buyers of traffic, people who they know are trafficked, right? Ensuring that that it's criminalized in some way, right? And not just turning a blind eye. You can also support organizations. You don't have to support PathFinders, but you can also find other local organizations that are doing this work and volunteer your time, right, as a psychologist, to be able to sit down with somebody and say, look, what have you gone through? This is how my this is how my knowledge can actually be beneficial to you as well.
So first of all, I would like just to add a comment on the question of visibility, because you know, Paola, Nigerian women are extremely visible. We don't see them here, because here we are, you know, in a little slice of paradise. But if you go to Calenzano, you go to the northern parts, or if you also go in the outskirts of many Italian cities, you see them. And then I think that, you know, Yvonne's comments was exactly that. The problem is those black bodies don't matter as much as other bodies do. And the problem is also that you will see in many Italian contexts, the Northeast in particular, the problem of trafficked women in the streets is narrated in terms of degrado urbano. So the problem is how to fight the degrado urbano. How do you translate degrado urbano? Urban decadence? Urban decay. So I would say urban decay, because of course the fact that you have women sold as slaves in our streets is urban decay, no? As though you have a flower bed that is not well kept. So I would say this is first of all one very important point. Second, you said very rightly that we need to find African solutions to African problems. On the other hand, we need to find European solutions to European problems. And the European problem and the Italian problem, as Alessandra said in the conference, is the demand. So I would say this is definitely something, it's a field of action for us. The other thing that is also very important, as Marina Callori was mentioning, is Article 18. Because in fact on this Article 18 there is a lot of work of advocacy that could be made, because the law is there are some NGOs that are trying to use it, and this could be somehow a lever to guarantee to a woman at least the time to get herself back on her feet. The last thing that I wanted to say, it's about Europe, because rightly you mentioned the Italian-Libya agreement. Now, I do not want to lessen in any way Italian responsibilities. I just want to add another piece. The problem is not solely Italian responsibility, but is the European Union. Because also the European Union has tolerated the agreement with Libya. Furthermore, the European Union has also made the agreement with Turkey to make sure that something similar happens on the Balkan bloc. So this is a European issue, and this is a European action on European problems, because on the one hand, the European Union is now producing legislation, isn't it, has identified the crime, the offense of reduction into slavery. But with one hand, they give us this legislative instrument against trafficking. With the other hand, they give us this kind of agreement on asylum seeker, illegal immigrants, basically making every human being that comes from below Sicily an illegal.
Yeah, yeah.
Quindi, you see, this is very much our European agenda. We should take the example of the mafias. You told us how the mafia are very good at making networks. Well, NGOs and activists, we should learn from them.
You know, Yvonne and I were talking earlier, she was saying how you felt like, especially with Italy, you were so sympathetic because they were in an untenable position that the EU is leaving you kind of out there to dry.
Yeah.
And I thought that I appreciate the fact that that was something that you had noted and called out. And thank you for making that so clear, because this is not something that one country alone is going to be able to solve.
Right, yeah. I mean, I don't know, I know obviously the economic crisis here was, already put Italy in a difficult position, right? So I'm just trying to imagine as a Nigerian, receiving 180,000 more people, right? And trying to absorb that, and the European Union kind of, saying, hey, it's your problem, right? So I don't know, I'm sure many of you know about the Dublin Agreement, right? And the fact that you can come into Europe, in the first place that you're fingerprinted is where you're stuck, right? And so if you have the majority of people coming to Italy, and then someone trying to go to France, and they say, no, you first came you arrived in Italy first, you have to apply for asylum in Italy, again, that's problematic, right? So it's really unfair what the European Union is doing,
And I think it wasn't I don't know that it was your year, but one of the other women who had participated in our program, who was almost, she was saying such similar things. She was from Greece, and she was saying, come on, they're just coming aboard, and you're just hanging us out to dry. And I feel like there are certain countries that have really borne the brunt, and it hasn't been equally distributed, despite promises to the contrary.
Yeah, because Greece is the other country that has also taken on hundreds of thousands of migrants as well, and so it does put a strain on the economy, and so in some ways you can almost say, I understand, I almost feel bad, but until Europe starts to actually prioritize migrants over the migrant crisis, you're really not going to be able to resolve it. You have to start to prioritize people over the problem.
So maybe we can take one more question. Or maybe two if there's a student question.
Thanks. Hi, Evan. Thanks for your work to start with. I run a Tuscan refugee home. I sent you the book about it. And I worked closely with 6 Nigerian girls in a sort of larger way, with other girls too. And I want to come back to one thing you said, who's missing at the table? And to me, from my experience, and we had a cultural mediator, one of my colleagues is a survivor from Nigerian, really, courageous, bright woman. And when I started, I thought, okay, the issue is that the girls don't get the message from me because I'm sort of a privileged middle-class woman. And then I hope that would change with Vivian. And it didn't really. And what happened, a part of fear and other things, is that for many of the girls, they see some success stories. So they'll see via Facebook, via Twitter, they're young, the youngest girls here, we all have dreams. I remember how I was at that age, sort of reckless. They invested so much already into that dream and sacrificed so much already. So just going to tell them, say, listen, it's going to be horrid, won't help. I actually had girls disappearing, being on the road in Italy and coming back to the refugee home and still going out again. And a big issue was because they saw, and one of the girls I worked with, she sort of made it. She has an Italian partner now who paid off her debt. She lives a sort of nice, not a nice life, sort of a working life, but she has a job now, she's studying. So she has found a way to achieve her dream, and she's sharing that, of course, on Facebook. Other girls see it. And I think that's something we have to address, that it's not just fear, it's also something really strong that at that age, when you're 18, when you're 20, you believe that you might be the only one who's going to make it. And that's a very strong thing, and that's nothing, and we tried with Articolo 18, we tried with showing what's happening out there. They've been on the road, and nevertheless, and that's something to me also I sort of admired them also for it. You know, they said, I don't care, I'm going to get there. Yeah. And so literally Vivian's experience as a survivor who talked to them was that she felt their sort of reaction was, that's not going to be my story. Yeah. My story is going to be different. Yeah. And that's a big, sort of from a direct encounters, that's something I didn't expect, because as a sort of a privileged Swiss woman, you think as soon as you explain what's going on, but it's not like that. It's more complicated. And that's what I meant, you know, like, that's a sort of dynamic, but it's also people, I think, of hope I worked with, who is sitting in Turin now, and she's not taking part in this discussion, but she's sharing a message continuously. So that's something.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important point, because, you know, part of what we've done with our research is create what we refer to as a vulnerability criteria, right? So it's looking at the survivors that we've worked with over the last few years between the ages of 15 and 25, right? And really creating these 12 points. And we know that if a girl fits into, you know, 5 or more of what's on our vulnerability criteria, that within 1 to 3 years they're going to be successfully recruited into trafficking, right? And so one of those points is if they have either somebody who's already been trafficked in Europe, or if they have access to social media. Because you find a lot of girls here, as much as they're suffering and are living, you know, having sex with 15 men every single day, they're still on social media smiling next to a, you know, BMW, or, you know, standing next to, you know, a big Louis Vuitton store, knowing that that's not their actual reality. And so what that does is just fuel this desire in our girls in Nigeria that are like, well, you know, when I get there, that's going to be my story. And there is this Nigerian sort of mentality, particularly for our girls from Edo State. We refer to it as it's not my portion. You know, meaning that, yes, that may have happened to you, but for whatever reason, God's going to protect me specifically, and I'm not the one who's going to drown in the Mediterranean, because, you know, that happened to you, but it's not going to happen to me. It's a very, very common mentality, you know, in Nigeria, particularly in Edo State.
Well, thank you very much. You've had a long day, and we're ready to let you relax a little bit now. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you.